The day I handed James and Emma the legal papers, the silence in the room was deafening. They both stared at me, disbelief painted on their faces. The documents weren't just any papers. They were the final testament of everything they'd tried to take from me. As I placed the envelope on the table, I could see the flicker of panic in their eyes. "What is this?" James stammered, his voice shaking. I didn't say a word. I just let them read. The papers outlined the entire inheritance, the rights to the property, and every single asset they'd assumed they would steal from me. I watched as Emma's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she looked at the notarized signature of the estate lawyer I had quietly hired behind their backs. "This isn't possible," Emma whispered, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "You can't do this." James exploded, slamming his hand on the table, his face flushed with rage. I didn't flinch. "I already did," I said calmly, my voice steady and controlled. "I've made sure this house stays mine. All of it. And I've taken the necessary steps to protect my future from both of you." The moment they realized what I had done, the accounts I'd transferred, the assets I had secured, the property deed now legally in my name, they knew their game was up. Emma's mask slipped, and I saw her for the manipulative woman she truly was. The tears didn't come. Instead, I felt an immense weight lift off my shoulders. "You'll regret this," Emma spat, but her words had no power anymore. They were empty threats. As James and Emma stood there, defeated and furious, I stood up. "I've lived long enough to know that family can be your greatest ally, or your worst enemy. You chose to be enemies," I said, watching them both, their faces twisted in disbelief. I picked up my purse and walked to the door. "I'm done here," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. They didn't move, not a word left their mouths as I stepped out of the house, my house, the place they thought they would strip away from me. And as I drove away, I realized I had not only regained my home and my wealth, I had reclaimed my dignity, my power, and my future. No one could ever take that from me again. The chapter was closed and I was finally free. I've always believed that family should be a place of support and love, but I never imagined it would turn into a place of betrayal. Those words echoed in Mildred's mind as she sat at her kitchen table, the house that had been her home for over 30 years now feeling foreign. The smell of her husband's old cologne still lingered in the air, but it couldn't mask the emptiness she now felt. At 70, Mildred had never expected her life to take such a drastic turn. After her husband's death, James, her son, had promised that they would take care of everything, that she would never be alone. But the truth, the cold, harsh truth, was that James and his wife Emma were slowly pushing her out of the home that she and her husband had worked so hard to build. What started as subtle hints about the house being too big for her now felt like a direct attack on everything Mildred had ever known. She had brushed off the small signs, the distance, the coldness, but as the weeks passed, the betrayal became undeniable. Mildred's world was crumbling around her, and she felt powerless. But today, as she sat there, her fingers tracing the edges of the letter she had just received from her lawyer, something shifted inside her. The papers in front of her weren't just legal documents, they were her lifeline. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let them take everything from her, not her home, not her dignity. She would take back control. It wasn't going to be loud, it wasn't going to be dramatic. But she would make sure that James and Emma saw just how wrong they were. She stood up from the table, her movements slow but deliberate, and walked to the front door. As she stepped outside, the wind hit her face, but it wasn't the chill of winter she felt. It was something else, something stronger. She had nothing left to lose, and this time she would be the one to decide her future. Mildred had always prided herself on being the glue that held her family together, but now, as the days grew longer and the house quieter, she felt the weight of that bond slipping away. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt hollow. Her son James, whom she had raised with so much love and care, had become a stranger. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional, as if a wall had been slowly built between them. Emma, his wife, had always been a bit distant, but now her coldness was palpable. Mildred could feel it every time they spoke, or more accurately, every time they didn't. The promises James had made to her were slowly unraveling. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was everything. They had planned it all so carefully, and Mildred had been blind to it. She had thought that their intentions were pure, that her son and daughter-in-law truly wanted to help her, but it was all a lie. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks when James had casually mentioned the house one afternoon, as if it was a given that she would leave. "Mom, we think it's time you moved somewhere more manageable," he had said, his voice so calm, so matter-of-fact, as if he wasn't talking about the home where she had spent the last 30 years of her life. Her heart had dropped at those words. "But this is my home," she had protested, her voice shaking. "I've lived here with your father. This is where we raised you." But James only nodded, as if she were talking about something trivial, something to be easily dismissed. Emma, standing beside him, gave her that polite but empty smile that never quite reached her eyes. Mildred had known then that this was more than just a suggestion. It was their plan all along. The betrayal was sharp, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, calculated, and now Mildred was faced with a choice. She could let them push her out, let them take everything from her, or she could fight back. The decision was clear. No more waiting for their scraps. She would not be discarded. She had spent years taking care of others, always putting their needs first, but now it was time to put herself first. It was time to take control. She had been left with nothing but a quiet resolve and a burning determination. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about her dignity, her right to live her life on her terms. As Mildred sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the phone, she realized this was the moment. This was when she would take the first step in reclaiming everything that was rightfully hers. She didn't need to ask anyone for permission. She would get a lawyer. She would protect herself. She would take control. And in the end, James and Emma would learn the hard way that they couldn't take advantage of her any longer. Mildred sat quietly in her favorite chair, the one by the window where she used to watch the seasons change with her husband. The house felt different now, colder, emptier. Every room held memories, but those memories now seemed to be slipping away, overshadowed by the growing tension with James and Emma. Her hands rested on her lap, steady, no longer trembling with uncertainty. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. The lawyer's office had been reassuring, even if she had been reluctant to trust anyone outside her family. The lawyer had listened, had understood the situation, and had promised to help her retain what was rightfully hers. The legal documents were now in motion. She was taking control piece by piece. It was strange, this feeling of power that had slowly crept in. Mildred had spent so much of her life giving, caring for her family, for James. But now, as she waited for her next steps to unfold, she realized she was done playing the role of the helpless mother. The betrayal was painful, but it had also been a wake-up call. She had been too trusting, too willing to believe that James would always be there for her. The truth was, he had always been more concerned about his own interests, and Emma had been the driving force behind it all. Emma, with her sweet smile and calculating eyes, had played her part so well, so convincingly. Mildred had seen through the mask now. The plan was clear. They wanted the house, and they had been using Mildred's grief as a way to get it. She could see it in their eyes, the way they treated her like a burden, the way they spoke to her as if her years of sacrifice meant nothing. But she wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. The papers were only the beginning. The next step was to protect her future, to ensure that no one could ever take advantage of her again. Mildred wasn't naive anymore. She wasn't just a mother. She was a woman who had lived through loss and pain and had come out stronger. She had nothing left to lose, and that was her greatest strength. As the days passed, Mildred began to make plans. She started looking into options for her future, ways to live independently, and without relying on anyone else. The thought of moving on her own wasn't as frightening as it had once seemed. She had her independence now, something that had been taken from her without her even realizing it. She wasn't going to wait for James and Emma to give her permission to live her life. She was taking her life back. And when the time came, she would stand in front of them, calm, composed, and in complete control. James and Emma wouldn't know what hit them. Mildred had been the one to carry the weight of their lies for too long, but not anymore. She would protect what she had left, and in doing so, she would reclaim her strength. The phone rang and she answered without hesitation. "I'm ready," she said, the words echoing with a newfound confidence. "Make sure everything is in place. I'm not backing down." She hung up, feeling a sense of clarity that she had not felt in years. The next chapter of her life was about to begin, and this time it would be on her terms. Mildred took a deep breath as she walked down the hallway, each step echoing through the house. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. The decision she had made wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She had spent days thinking about what she needed to do, how to regain control of her life. And now it was time to confront the people who had taken so much from her. She had gathered her thoughts, made her plans, and was ready for what was coming next. As she entered the living room, she saw James and Emma sitting on the couch, casually chatting as if everything was normal. It disgusted her. They had been acting like nothing was wrong, as if their manipulation hadn't broken something inside her. The facade they had put up for so long was finally cracking. She could see it in the way Emma avoided eye contact, the way James kept glancing at his phone as if he had more important things to do than talk to his mother. But Mildred was no longer the person they could push aside. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady and calm. Both James and Emma looked up, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. "What's going on, Mom?" James asked, though there was no real concern in his voice. It was a question said out of obligation. Mildred didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked over to the coffee table, picked up the papers she had placed there earlier, and set them down in front of them. "These are the legal documents I've had drawn up," she said, her voice firm. "This house is mine. And I'm not leaving." James opened his mouth to speak, but Mildred raised a hand, silencing him. "You and Emma thought you could just take everything from me, didn't you? The house, my money, my life. But you were wrong." Emma's face flushed with embarrassment, and James's expression hardened. He was trying to maintain his composure, but the tension was palpable. "Mom, we didn't mean," James started, but Mildred cut him off. "No, James, you didn't mean anything. You never meant to care. It was all about what you could get from me. You've been planning this for months, and I've seen through it all." Mildred paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She wasn't going to back down anymore. She wasn't going to be the victim. "I've made sure that everything is in place," she continued. "You don't have control over me anymore. I'm taking my life back." James and Emma were silent now, their faces a mix of shock and frustration. It was clear they hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Mildred to fight back. "I'm not going anywhere," Mildred said one last time, standing tall as she faced them. "And you'll have to learn to accept that." The silence in the room was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable for her. It was a silence of victory, a silence that said everything she needed to say without a single word more. She had taken control of her life, and nothing they said or did could change that. She turned and walked out of the room, her steps confident, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Mildred was finally free. Mildred hadn't expected an easy path, but she certainly hadn't expected this. The days following her confrontation with James and Emma were filled with uncertainty, but there was something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. A sense of freedom, a feeling that she had taken back control of her life. For the first time in years, she woke up every morning without the constant weight of worry pressing on her chest. The house, though still large and empty without her husband, no longer felt like a prison. It was her space again. She had made the decision to keep it, and nothing would make her second-guess that choice. Yet, as the days passed, Mildred could feel the tension building. It wasn't just the unresolved silence between her and her son. It was the growing realization that things would never be the same again. Her relationship with James, once so strong and full of trust, had been shattered, and Emma's coldness still lingered in the background, like a shadow she couldn't escape. It didn't matter. Mildred knew she had done the right thing. The feeling of betrayal had hurt more than anything else, but the worst part was the realization that she had let it happen for so long. She had trusted them, believed their promises, but now she understood that those promises had always been about control, not care. In the weeks that followed, Mildred focused on herself. She reached out to old friends she hadn't spoken to in years, joined a book club at the local library, and even began volunteering at the senior center down the street. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Her days were no longer consumed with worrying about her son's approval or Emma's judgment. She had found peace in her own company. But as the holidays approached, Mildred couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness. It was hard to ignore the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence that stretched too long between her and her family. James still hadn't reached out, and she hadn't heard a word from Emma either. She hadn't expected an apology, but the absence of any effort from them felt like another betrayal. It was Christmas Eve when the phone rang. Mildred hadn't expected anyone to call, but when she saw the caller ID, her heart skipped a beat. It was James. Her first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something stopped her. Maybe it was hope or maybe it was just curiosity. She answered the phone with a steady voice, trying to hide the nervousness she felt. "Mom," James said, his voice strained, almost apologetic. "We need to talk." For a moment, she didn't say anything. What could he possibly want to say after everything that had happened? She had no expectations, but she wasn't about to let him control her emotions anymore. "What is it, James?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about everything that happened. I know I hurt you and I'm sorry. I want to make things right." Mildred's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You've said that before, James. But the question is, do you mean it this time?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She could almost hear him trying to find the right words. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "I was wrong. I didn't see what I was doing until it was too late. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." Mildred closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acknowledging the damage that had been done. And in this moment, she realized something that had eluded her for so long. She didn't need James's apology to feel whole again. She had already taken back control of her life. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice calm. "But I don't need you to fix this for me. I'm doing just fine on my own." James was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I just hope one day we can move past this." "Maybe," Mildred answered. "But that's up to you." She hung up the phone, feeling a strange sense of closure. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't sad. She was just free. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled to herself. Christmas wasn't about the gifts or the people who had let her down. It was about embracing the life she had left and finding peace in the choices she made. She looked around her home, the place that had once been a symbol of her sacrifices, and now it was a symbol of her strength. Mildred had won. She had reclaimed her life, her home, and her dignity. Nothing else mattered. Mildred sat on the porch, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the front yard. The world seemed still, peaceful, as though everything was in place. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she had been through in the past few months. She had stood up for herself, faced the harsh truths, and now here she was, alone but stronger than ever. The house around her was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Felt like her own. The weight of the past year had begun to lift, and with it, a new sense of purpose filled her heart. Mildred had always been the caretaker, the one who held everything together. But now, for the first time, she was living for herself. She had worked hard for everything she had. Her home, her peace, and her independence. And no one, not even her own family, could take that away from her. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about what James had said to her, the apology he had offered. It wasn't much, but it had been enough to give her closure. For so long, she had been waiting for his acknowledgement, his validation. But now she realized that she didn't need it. She had already taken back control. She had already moved on. The realization settled in like a warm breeze. She didn't need to dwell on the past anymore. It was time to look forward, to embrace the future she had worked so hard to create. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Susan, her niece. "Merry Christmas, Aunt Mildred. Hope you're doing well. I'm thinking of you today." Mildred smiled, the warmth of her niece's words lifting her spirits even more. She had spent too many years worrying about the wrong things, about the wrong people. It was time to focus on the ones who truly cared about her. The ones who saw her for who she was, not for what they could take from her. As the day wore on, Mildred began to make plans for the future. She had always dreamed of traveling, seeing places she had only read about in books. Now, with her newfound freedom, she could finally make those dreams a reality. She began researching destinations, starting with the coast of Maine. She had always loved the idea of visiting the ocean, feeling the salty breeze on her face. It was something she had put off for far too long, always telling herself there would be time. Now there was nothing holding her back. She was free to do whatever she wanted. Her heart lightened at the thought of all the possibilities ahead. No longer bound by expectations or the weight of other people's choices, Mildred was free to create her own path. She could live on her terms, and that was all she had ever wanted. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Mildred felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had fought for her life, and now she was finally living it. For the first time in a long time, she could say that she was truly happy. The journey had been hard, but it had led her here. Stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Mildred awoke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the world outside seemed to be at peace. She stretched her arms above her head, feeling the stillness in her bones, the calm that had taken over her life in the last few months. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't wake up with a pit of anxiety in her stomach. Her mind wasn't clouded with thoughts of betrayal or regret. It was clear. She was at peace. The house, though still large and quiet, no longer felt like a cage. Felt like home. Her home. The place where she had the freedom to make her own choices. The place where she could live life on her terms. She had fought for this, and now she was finally living it. As she sat at her kitchen table sipping her coffee, she thought back to all that had happened. She had been broken, betrayed, and abandoned by the people she had loved and trusted most. But now she saw it all differently. What had once felt like the worst thing that could happen to her had turned out to be the beginning of a new chapter. The events with James and Emma, though painful, had pushed her to stand up for herself. They had shown her that she didn't need to rely on anyone else for her happiness, her security, or her worth. She could be strong on her own. And that strength had opened up a world of possibilities. Mildred smiled to herself as she thought about the plans she had made in the last few weeks. She had already booked her first solo trip. She was going to the coast of Maine. She had always dreamed of seeing the ocean, of feeling the salty breeze on her face. And now she was finally going to do it. There were so many places she wanted to visit, so many things she wanted to experience. She was no longer waiting for someone to tell her it was okay. She was doing it on her own. Her heart raced with excitement as she thought about all the adventures that awaited her. Mildred had spent so much of her life taking care of others, putting their needs above her own. But now she was taking care of herself. She was putting herself first, and it felt amazing. The guilt she had once carried like a heavy burden had lifted. She was no longer afraid of being selfish. She had earned the right to live for herself. As the days went by, Mildred continued to find joy in the simple things. She took long walks around her neighborhood, enjoying the peace and quiet. She spent time with friends she hadn't seen in years, reconnecting with the people who truly cared about her. And as she spent more time focusing on herself, she realized something. She was happier than she had ever been. She had found her freedom. No longer held back by the expectations of others, Mildred was free to shape her own future. She no longer needed validation from anyone. She had already proven to herself that she could stand strong, alone if need be, and still thrive. On the surface, it seemed like Mildred had lost so much. Her family, her home, her sense of security. But in reality, she had gained so much more. She had gained her independence, her peace of mind, and most importantly, her sense of self-worth. It was a victory she would never take for granted. The road ahead was hers to walk, and for the first time in years, she was excited for what was to come. Mildred stood on the beach, the salty air filling her lungs as she watched the waves crash against the shore. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, one that she had longed for but never thought she would experience. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the endless possibilities that awaited her. For so long, she had been trapped in the life others had expected of her, bound by duty and obligation. But now she was free. She had made it here on her own, without anyone's help or approval. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. She could feel the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders as she stood there, letting the waves wash over her feet. There was something about the ocean that felt like a reset, a fresh start. As she walked along the shoreline, Mildred thought about all that had led her to this moment. The betrayal, the heartache, the struggle. It had all been worth it. It had pushed her to this point, to the life she was now building for herself. And though she would never forget the pain, she no longer let it define her. She had learned to let go, to forgive herself, and most importantly, to embrace the future. She had taken control of her life, and it felt like the first time in years that she could breathe without the weight of the world on her chest. As she continued walking, Mildred thought about the journey that lay ahead. She didn't know exactly where it would take her, but she was ready. She had made plans to visit more places, to explore the world she had once put on hold. For the first time in her life, she was doing things for herself, and that made all the difference. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change, but Mildred had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, she knew that this was only the beginning. The future was hers to shape, and she was finally ready to live it on her own terms. Mildred sat at the small table in her cozy hotel room, looking out at the waves crashing on the shore. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the water. She had spent the last few days exploring, visiting places she had only dreamed about. The freedom felt incredible. Each day she woke up with a sense of excitement, knowing that she was the one in control of her life now. No longer burdened by the weight of others' expectations, she was discovering who she truly was outside of her roles as a wife, mother, and grandmother. The trip had been everything she needed and more. As she sipped her tea, she thought about the call she had received from Susan a few days ago. Mildred had been hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect, but Susan's words had surprised her. "Aunt Mildred," she had said with a softness that made Mildred's heart swell, "I'm proud of you. I know things haven't been easy, but you're doing it. You're living your life the way you've always deserved to." Mildred had never expected to hear such words from anyone, especially not from someone in her family. It was as if Susan saw her for the first time, truly saw her, not just as the person who had always taken care of everyone, but as a woman with dreams, desires, and a future. That phone call had been a turning point for Mildred. It made her realize that she had been so focused on pleasing everyone else for so long that she had lost sight of her own worth. But now, with Susan's encouragement, Mildred knew she was on the right path. She had spent years trying to be everything for everyone else, but now it was her turn. She didn't need to wait for approval from anyone. She could create her own happiness. And that realization was freeing. Mildred had already planned her next adventure. After spending a few more days by the ocean, she would head to the mountains for some hiking, a chance to reconnect with nature and challenge herself. It wasn't about escaping from anything anymore. It was about embracing the life she had built for herself. The loneliness she once feared now felt like an old friend, a reminder that she didn't need anyone else to complete her. She was whole. As she packed her bag for her next journey, Mildred felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't running from anything. She was simply living the life she had always deserved. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And the best part was she was doing it all on her own terms. Mildred found herself sitting in a quiet cafe in the small town she had decided to visit on a whim. The walls were adorned with local artwork, and the soft hum of conversation filled the room. It was a perfect moment of peace, the kind she had come to cherish since taking control of her life. Her coffee sat in front of her, cooling slowly, but she didn't mind. She was in no rush anymore. She had been rushing for so long, trying to meet expectations that weren't her own, trying to please people who never truly appreciated her. But now, sitting in that cafe, she felt a deep sense of calm. She had learned to let go of the things that weighed her down, and as she sipped her coffee, she could feel that weight lift more and more each day. This wasn't the life she had imagined in her youth, but it was a life she was now creating for herself. She was no longer defined by her family's expectations or their demands. She was her own person, and that realization felt liberating. As she glanced around the cafe, her thoughts wandered to James and Emma. She hadn't heard from them in weeks, and honestly, she hadn't missed the constant tension. Their last conversation had been awkward, but it had also been an ending of sorts. She had said what needed to be said, and now there was nothing left to prove. Her family wasn't going to dictate her life anymore. It was time to move forward. She had spent so many years waiting for others to validate her choices, to approve of her decisions. But now she understood that she didn't need anyone else's approval. She had everything she needed within herself. The sun outside had dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the streets, and for a moment Mildred just sat there, soaking it all in. She wasn't looking for anything anymore. She was simply enjoying the present, something she had never fully done before. Her life had been about fixing things, about making everyone else's lives easier. But now she was focused on herself, and it felt more than right. Felt like freedom. The next few months were already beginning to take shape in her mind. She would keep traveling, keep exploring new places. She would continue to meet new people, people who valued her for who she was, not for what she could give them. She would never stop learning, never stop growing. And maybe, just maybe, she would find new relationships that were based on mutual respect and understanding, not manipulation. But for now, the only relationship she needed to nurture was the one she had with herself. And that, she realized, was the most important one of all. She finished her coffee, left a tip for the barista, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The world felt wide open, and Mildred was finally ready to embrace it, fully and without hesitation. Mildred awoke the next morning with a sense of peace she had never known. The soft rays of the morning sun crept through the curtains, warming the room with a gentle light. She lay in bed for a few moments, just soaking in the tranquility. For years her mornings had been filled with the chaos of family responsibilities, constant worry, and the overwhelming feeling of being pulled in every direction. But now everything was different. The world outside her window seemed quieter, more still, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could truly breathe. She had taken control of her life, and now she was living it in a way that was entirely her own. It was almost surreal to think about how much had changed in such a short period. From the day she had decided to stand up for herself, everything had shifted. The weight she had carried for so long had started to lift, and in its place, a new sense of freedom had emerged. She no longer felt like she was living for anyone else. She was living for herself. She got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet street. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. But to Mildred, everything had changed. She had spent so many years trying to please everyone else, trying to meet their expectations, and in the process she had lost herself. But not anymore. Now she was finding herself again, one day at a time. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Susan, her niece. "Aunt Mildred, I'm so proud of you. I hope you're having the time of your life on this trip. You deserve it all." Mildred smiled as she read the message. Susan's words meant more to her than she could explain. They were a reminder that she wasn't alone, that there were still people in her life who cared about her for who she truly was. As the days passed, Mildred found herself doing things she had always dreamed of, but never had the courage to pursue. She took up painting, something she had always wanted to try but had put off for years. She joined a hiking group and spent weekends exploring new trails. She even started writing in a journal, recording her thoughts and reflections on her journey. The more she embraced her new life, the more she realized just how much she had been holding herself back all these years. It wasn't just about the freedom she had gained from her family's expectations. It was about the freedom to be herself, to live her life in the way that felt right for her. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mildred reflected on how far she had come. There had been a time when she would have been too afraid to step out on her own, too afraid to stand up for herself. But now she knew her own worth. She knew that she didn't need anyone else's approval to feel validated. She had everything she needed within herself. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Mildred closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the cool evening breeze on her skin. She was content, at peace with herself and with the life she had created. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was hers. And that was enough. Mildred stood in the living room, staring at the documents in her hands. The time had come. For weeks, she had been preparing for this moment, gathering every piece of evidence, every legal document, and every piece of truth she had once been too afraid to acknowledge. Today, she was going to take back everything that had been taken from her. Her heart pounded as the doorbell rang. She had called James and Emma, asking them to come over to discuss some final matters. They had no idea what was coming. As they entered the room, James looked the same as always, confident, self-assured. acting as if nothing had changed. Emma, however, seemed uneasy. Her gaze flickered around the room, and for a moment Mildred could see the fear lurking beneath her polished exterior. She had always been able to read Emma, ever since the first time they met. The way she pretended to care, the false kindness in her voice, it had always been a mask. But now that mask was slipping, and Mildred was about to reveal the truth. "Mom, what is this all about?" James asked, his tone dismissive, as if this was just another one of Mildred's attempts to make peace. But this wasn't about peace. It was about justice. Mildred took a deep breath, her hand steady as she placed the papers on the table between them. "These are the legal documents that prove everything you've done," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "You've been lying to me, manipulating me, and using me for your own gain. And now it's time for you both to face the consequences." James's face turned pale. He looked at Emma, who was now visibly sweating, her hand trembling as she reached for the papers. Mildred watched them both, not an ounce of fear in her. "What are you talking about?" Emma's voice wavered as she spoke, but Mildred could hear the guilt in it. "You think you can just take everything from me? My house, my money, my life." Mildred continued, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not going to be your pawn anymore. I've already transferred everything back into my name, and I've secured my finances. Your attempts to strip me of everything have failed." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "You can't do this. You have no proof." Mildred smiled, the confidence in her voice unmistakable. "I have all the proof I need. The bank records, the property transfers, everything you've done behind my back. It's all here." She slid a folder across the table, and James hesitated before flipping it open. He saw the documents, his face turned from disbelief to anger. "You're insane," he muttered, his voice cracking. But it was too late. Mildred had won. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it. She had secured everything. Her home, her finances, and most importantly, her dignity. She was no longer the victim. James and Emma had spent so long manipulating her, treating her like she didn't matter. But now they were the ones who had been exposed. "You're not getting away with this," Mildred said, her voice steady. "The legal system will take care of the rest. You'll have to answer for what you've done. And as for me, I'm done. I'm free." She stood up, and for the first time in years she felt powerful. As James and Emma stood there in stunned silence, Mildred walked past them, her back straight, her heart light. She had fought for herself, and now she was free. She had reclaimed everything that was rightfully hers, and nothing would ever take that from her again.